Hello and welcome to a special GZERO media presentation from the 2026 Munich Security Conference. I'm David Sanger, White House and National Security Correspondent for the New York Times. This is a continuing conversation, part of the Global Stage series. It's a partnership between GZERO and Microsoft, and we're coming to you from the Hotel Bayerischer, which for 6 decades has been the home to the Munich Security Forum, a gathering of world leaders and top experts in security, defense, and diplomacy. And it's never been clearer than in recent times that both the threats the world is facing and the alliances that have traditionally cooperated to fight them are changing rapidly. And the result is a deep uncertainty here in Europe and around the world that you've been able to hear from the open stages, but particularly when you've talked privately to leaders who have been coming through the hotel. So we're going to talk today about the intertwined technology and defense issues and ways to build greater security resilience in a fractured political reality. And so we have with us Brad Smith, the Vice Chair and President of Microsoft, Ian Bremmer, who's the founder and president of the Eurasia Group and GZERO Media, and Benedetta Berti, the Secretary General of NATO's Parliamentary Assembly. So Ian, let me start with you. In this year's Munich Security Report, there's a description of a world reflected, I think, as well in some of your writings, that is a bit multipolar, but mostly just disorderly right now. And from your vantage point, I'm wondering, what do you think is the greatest danger for Europe right now? The escalation risks that we see, the erosion of trust with the United States, or the lack of coordination in thinking about what major threats are?
I think it's the latter. I don't believe that there is an existential threat to NATO today, in part because it still serves a significant purpose for all of the members. None of them actually want to leave, even if they feel like they can't trust a lot of the guarantees that they've had historically. The threats are certainly much more clear. The money that's being spent is more significant. Trump takes credit for that, even if he doesn't necessarily show a lot of appreciation. All of those things are real. On the other hand, if you ask me what might make NATO less relevant in the next 3, 5, 10 years, it has much more to do with the fact that a lot of the growing threats and the ability to ensure security are coming very quickly from new technologies that NATO has not been initially built to actually integrate, incorporate, and deal with. So it's, can you work fast enough to reform and advance your capabilities at a time when you're infighting about, what the basic architecture actually is? That's what worries me about.
It's interesting because when Vice President Vance was here last year, you may remember, Ian, he said the greatest threat to Europe was Europe itself. Yeah. And, you've read all the civilizational erasure. So that's pretty well gone, though, this year, isn't it?
Well, it's not gone in the sense that there are a lot of people that remember it. And you saw that in Merz's speech yesterday. You saw that in Macron's speech yesterday. They're hurt. They're still angry. Marco Rubio is going to give his speech shortly. I assure you he is not going to be insulting the Europeans gratuitously in a way that, frankly, Vance did, and that it elicited this incredible moment when the defense minister from Germany stood up and said, shouted, "This is unacceptable." I had never seen a moment like that before at Munich. But we have to understand that there's a big, big difference between what we've seen over the last 10, 15 years, where U.S. national interests are legitimately evolving. America legitimately believes that Europe and others have not spent enough on their defense, and they want to see a lot of burden sharing. And Rubio will talk about that. People need to adapt to that. The United States is not prepared to support the level of free trade architecture it has historically. Democrats or Republicans, doesn't matter who the next president's going to be, they need to adapt to that. But we've also seen a number of issues where, frankly, and it's painful to say this, where Donald Trump has advanced personal interests that do not align with the national interests of the country. Now, the good news is that will not outlast Trump. So that level of unreliability, that level of we have no idea the chaos coming from Trump and what he's pushing for, that's not something you need to respond to structurally, but you do need to see pushback. And by the way, that was Greenland. Okay. The Danes, they were prepared to talk with the Americans about all the national security issues that mattered to the U.S. They weren't prepared to say, no, you can just have it. There you need to push back.
So, Brad, these geopolitical complications come at a sort of remarkable moment in the cyber wars. The speed, the scale, the sophistication of the threats is stepping up. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how the Europeans have seen it, how we've seen it in the United States.
I think we're fundamentally seeing three things come together in terms of cyber threats, and they're all being increasingly enhanced through the use of artificial intelligence, both to create the threat and to defend against it. One aspect focused especially in Europe is Russian activity. We've seen the first destructive attacks on NATO soil, on Poland. We see a hybrid war, obviously, that involves cyber activity with activity that is of a physical nature. I think that's a more serious threat than what we saw, say, 2 years ago. In China, I think the big issue is the extent of Chinese intrusion into the country's telecommunications network. And it's just been very difficult to expel all of that activity, given the sophisticated nature of the tactics the Chinese have used, given the diversified and fragmented and really decentralized nature of the telecommunications system.
And are AI systems at this point helping the defenders more, or are they speeding up that offense?
Well, I think it's actually on both sides. The challenge in some ways is from the attacker perspective. And you see this especially in ransomware. There's almost been a new layer of infrastructure that has been created to provide services to entities engaged in ransomware attacks. So it's the theft of, say, credentials, email names, passwords, the creation of virtual machines that can be used to launch attacks. And I think AI has been a game changer for them, unfortunately. Now, I will say, where you have defenders, whether it's a company like Microsoft or others in the industry, I think that we are using that to sort of on the counteroffensive, if you will, to disrupt and take out that infrastructure. We're finding more collaboration in two of the recent activities that we pursued. One was international with the U.S. and the U.K. Another involved the Nigerian police. So, we're seeing, I think, a combination of AI defenses and more collaboration as governments recognize that this is not something they should tolerate.
So, Benedetta, you've been very patient here. The hybrid threats that we're facing are not new at all to NATO. We've been discussing hybrid threats in these NATO meetings for more than a decade. So how is NATO adapting? How's the decision-making adapting to this? Because it strikes me that a lot of the discussions we're having now are pretty similar to what we had a few years ago.
Well, I would say that, first of all, we have a shared understanding that hybrid threats are a defining feature of our security environment. So this is a feature, it's not a bug. We know that our adversaries, our competitors, use all the tools in their toolbox systematically to sow distrust, to undermine our security, to seek to destabilize. So this is the new normal. And that's part of why we say, well, we may not be at war as NATO, but we're not at peace. So what do we do about it? A number of things. First of all, there is a big emphasis on coming together as allies to have a shared situational awareness, share intelligence, understand the patterns, put together all the dots on the individual hybrid attacks, whether it's undersea cable, information threats, energy blackmail, economic coercion, putting all that together to have a very real-time analysis and understanding of the situation. Then we work on resilience, which is really important. What do you do? Part of deterrence is building your resilience. Deterrence by denial, by strengthening yourself. So we work with all the allies on having basic criteria so that our 5G, electric grid, transportation systems, they all have shared objectives to be safe, to be resilient, to be redundant, so that they are less vulnerable to attack. Then the other part of the discussion is what are the options that we can employ together and individually to impose cost on the adversary.
Well, actually, I wanted to just jump on that briefly because and we've seen a lot of hybrid attacks in the past year or so. We haven't seen many costs imposed. Now, maybe you don't see all of them, but Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, I would say you don't see all of them, but I think that when you look at the, let's say, the Baltic Sea, which of course last year was a pretty significant area of risk for us. So what NATO did, it was start Baltic Sentry, a new deterrence and monitoring activity to increase deterrence in the Baltic Sea. So more patrolling, more shared situational awareness, more supporting Baltic states to then go into interdiction and stop potential threats. The net result, we have complicated Putin's life when it comes to the shadow fleet very significantly, which is very important. We have also not had any significant undersea cable incidents since. That's just one example, but I do think that we need to be very deliberate and say we're not powerless. We have options. Perhaps I would agree with you that sometimes we've been too timid in imposing costs on the adversary, and we have to do that more.
And Ian, one quick question, just quick answer from you and also from Brad on this. Would you advocate at this point imposing costs more publicly? We're not seeing a lot of attribution of these both physical and cyber side attacks.
I wouldn't if I thought that it actually revealed vulnerabilities that the Americans, the Europeans, are not yet prepared to actually respond to. But certainly to the extent that you can call out that these asymmetric attacks are directly happening and there is evidence for it, and so therefore the Russians are going to be hit back, yes, then I would say yes.
Brad, Microsoft has done probably more to sort of identify these and move in the courts to try to take them out. But
I definitely agree that there's been, I'll say, too timid a response. There is huge opportunity for more public attribution, not in every instance, but in many more than we've seen. And I think we have to start to move to have a real deterrent strategy. We're hoping we'll see that, including from the White House in the coming months. I think without cyber deterrence, we just create an ongoing environment where there are the asymmetric opportunities without fear of adverse consequences, and that is not a recipe for a safer world.
Great. Well, thank you, all three. Benedetta, I know you have to move on to some other things, but thank you for joining us. And we'll be back in just a moment from the 2026 Munich Security Conference. Welcome back. Yesterday, here in Munich, tech industry leaders came together to announce a new commitment to address growing concerns about foreign tech reliance in what are clearly pretty uncertain times here. Governments, particularly here in Europe, are confronting concerns about potential harms of social media, access to sovereign data, and the impact, of course, of artificial intelligence. We're going to take all of that up. Brad Smith and Ian are back with us, and now also we're being joined by Wolfgang Dierker, the Global Head of Government Affairs at SAP. Welcome, Wolfgang. Brad, tell us a little bit about this Trusted Tech Alliance that was announced yesterday. What problem is it addressing, and what difference does it make?
Well, I think this is actually one of the really significant steps to come out of the Munich Security Conference this year, because we have 16 companies, including SAP and Microsoft, from 11 countries, all global technology leaders, really all convicted and devoted to advancing digital trust and stability at a time when both are in short supply. Our fundamental message is we are working together to ensure that technology can move across borders, that we will stand up for common principles like ethical governance, secure technology, support for the rule of law, and protection of data. I think we can and will be a force to keep the world connected. And I think this is a time when that kind of connection is essential.
You know, one thing that does characterize this forum this year is I've heard more about AI concerns, as you would expect, and this goes in a sine wave as you've seen. But tell us a little bit about how the Tech Alliance would address that, since there doesn't seem to be much consensus on how you address most of those concerns.
Well, I think the opportunity is to do basically what you described. It is, Ian often points out, technology is global. AI is global. It is changing the economy and societies around the world. The only way, I think, for us to address this effectively is to collaborate, certainly among technology leaders, with a commitment to common principles, with a commitment to starting with self-attestation, but also independent assessments of what we do. We need to ensure that governments around the world can trust us, and I think that requires these kinds of principles, but real deeds, so they know what they're buying when they get things from us.
So, Wolfgang, we've seen European governments be pretty vocal about the sovereignty issues, the trust issues. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, what are you hearing today from your customers, from governments, that are sort of shaping your approach to this?
Thanks for having me, and it's great to be part of the Trusted Tech Alliance. SAP is a global provider of enterprise software and business AI, and we do critical processes for our customers in procurement, in finance, in human resources. And all of that builds on trust. We need the trust of our customers in SAP and in our software. What we hear from our customers right now is they need cloud software and they need artificial intelligence in order to stay competitive, in order to deal with the changes in global markets and the volatility in geopolitical uncertain times. What we specifically hear most recently is a heightened interest in sovereign cloud and sovereign AI, meaning customers, and in particular public sector customers, are looking for maximum control, maximum safety and security in their operations. This is something where we offer a breadth of solutions, always keeping the level of compliance controls and sovereign mechanisms in place, and that is something where we cooperate very much with international companies.
Does the sovereign nature of it mean it's got to stay within the country? I mean, obviously it's a cloud solution, and as Brad showed in the Ukraine example, you actually needed to move things out of Ukraine in order to keep it safe.
Yes, data residency is one key element of sovereignty, but the problem, David, is that we don't have a unified definition of sovereign, which is something we really need in order to be able to provide the compliant and the most performance solutions to our customers. So there is all sorts of sovereign cloud and sovereign AI, and we are offering all these elements to our customers. It's really like a menu approach that we offer.
And I would just add that what you see here in Germany, for example, is a collaboration, a partnership that includes Microsoft and SAP, a German entity called Delos, that provides a sovereign cloud solution really to meet the architectural requirements of the German public sector. So designed for Germany, operated in Germany, pursuant to German control, but combining the best of technologies from different countries.
So, Ian, tell us a little bit about how this fits into what we're obsessed with back in the States, which is the U.S.-China tech competition here. Chinese have some representation here, but not a whole lot. And they're not part of this tech alliance at this point, right?
That's correct.
Well, I mean, first of all, China is virtually absent from the substantive conversations of the Munich Security Conference this year, which is kind of a weird thing. It's in part because the U.S.-China relationship has stabilized somewhat and everyone's focused on the summit, but it's also in part because there are just bigger problems right now. Look, what we see is an absence of governance, an absence of regulation and responsibility in the technology and AI space from the Western governments themselves. And so the technology companies acting as tech sovereigns are taking some of this on themselves. Now, long term, the technology companies are much more committed to ensuring that there's rule of law and that there is alignment among global marketplaces than the United States government is, at least today. If that works, and if the Americans and the Europeans and others are nudged to continue to work together constructively in this space, ultimately that's more stabilizing for China because it's a framework that they can choose to be a part of over time that is powerful. But if they don't, if it doesn't work, and if we continue to see geopolitical fragmentation as opposed to technological alignment, then we're heading towards decoupling and a Cold War. And that's very dangerous because the AI space between the US and China has no coordination. It only has escalation, acceleration, and has literally zero trust. Remember, between the tech companies in the West and the governments in the West, even though trust has been breached, it hasn't been completely broken because the architecture still exists. The common values still are out there in the ether. Between the US and China and AI, there's literally nothing. And that's a space that is problematic.
Okay, do you, the absence of the Chinese really is notable here. How does that affect the landscape you see?
For SAP, it's important really to serve a global market with customers in all parts of the world, but also to do research and engineering in all parts of the world, which we do including China. I think what's really important here is when we look at Europe and at the whole regulatory landscape in Europe, that we've seen a level of over-regulation that is making it more difficult for our customers to operate here. Think of the AI Act, which has provisions where the standards, norms, and milestones are not even in place yet. Or think of the EU Data Act, where we have provisions now that make it difficult for European technology companies to actually comply with them because they don't really communicate with the limitations and the needs of European technology companies. So simplification is something that we would like to see in Europe much more. It's starting, which is something we call the digital omnibus here in Europe, but there is certainly much more that needs to happen. And in order to be able to operate globally, we need a harmonization, like I said before. The standards, the definitions of sovereign cloud and sovereign AI need to be defined so that we can provide our customers with unified solutions in a unified market.
Great. Well, I've got many more questions, but unfortunately we don't have any more time. So you can see more of this coverage and the whole Global Stage series at gzeromedia.com/global stage. But I really want to thank Ian Bremmer, Brad Smith, and Wolfgang Dierker, as well as Benedetta Berti, who was with us earlier, for their time today. And thanks to all of you for watching. I'm David Sanger, and have a great rest of the conference.